Hello Canada, Michele Tittler from Endrace-Based Law, and with me on the telephone is my political partner, Gerry Gagnon from Victoria, British Columbia. I'm in Vancouver. And we're starting a series of radio podcasts where Gerry gets to help us understand these race laws, the Constitution, and the effect all of these race laws are having on Canada, industry, and our country in general. So, hello, Gerry. How are you today?
I'm fine, Michelle. How are you doing?
Really good. So glad to be here with you and finally starting these radio podcasts, which we do plan to do often. And we're going to have people who can phone in as well. So this is a new phase of Endrace-Based Law. We've been at it for 2 years. And what we're excited about now is that for a change, we have Gerry involved in some of the discussions, and whereas before I was making videos, and now we have Gerry. So I'm going to turn it over, and even though the video is going to be on me, Gerry's going to talk. So Gerry, why don't you fill us in on what the whole petition is about?
Well, if you recall, Michelle, this all started from us just having discussions, telephone conversations about this whole issue, the whole segregation issue, if you will, in Canada, what's been a perpetual division between the Aboriginal people of this country and everyone else, and the way that division has been enshrined in law. And of course, that's based on the fact that the division is enshrined in our Constitution.
And why don't you give us Gerry, give us a background on when this was put into our Constitution?
Oh, for sure. From the very beginning. It's one of the original pieces of the 1867 Constitution. And it was done with the best of intentions. The fear at the time was that the Indian population, as they were referred to, was going to be swamped, as they eventually were, by the immigration into the country. And it was felt that they needed separate treatment to protect to try and protect them in some fashion.
The opposite to genocide, it was to protect them.
Well, yes, and certainly the religious people, although their fervor was somewhat overdone, their intentions, their intentions were good. They thought they were doing good. But the problem became that the division was enshrined in law, and all of the solutions that we've seen in recent times are using the law to try and overcome the initial problem. It's that old thing of repeating the same mistake over and over again and expecting a different result.
The theory of insanity by Albert Einstein.
Yeah, and this is a case of legal insanity, if you will. Mm-hmm. Well, the problem is the legal separation in the Constitution itself.
And so, Gerry,
no amount of tinkering with it or amending it or et cetera, it's just wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. It fundamentally undermines what we're trying to do as a nation here in Canada.
No, the 1867, you're referring to the Indian Act, correct?
Well, no, the Indian Act came along about 5 years later as the tool for administering this legal distinction that had been created.
Thank you. I didn't even know that myself. I didn't know that there was a separation of 5 years. Thank you.
So
see, I learned something new every day in this issue.
If they were going to be treated differently in a legal sense, then that had to be codified. Like, how were they going to be treated differently? How were the reserves going to be run? And that's why the Indian Act was written. Well,
it's the beginning of the segregation and the very real racism that did become cultivated over time, not intentionally to create racism, but more just out of, naivety.
I think naivety is a really good word for it. I really do. And that's not to say that there wasn't bigotry. That's not to say that there weren't evil people who were manipulating.
Always there are. Always.
I mean, those people are everywhere.
Yeah.
But that was not the impetus or the main thrust of it.
Yeah.
Those were people who leached off of it and manipulated it to their own advantage.
To this very day, there are lawyers who are leeching off of the misery of Aboriginals in Canada. It just makes, that's the part that's hard for you and I.
And so it is important for people, one of the things to understand is the Indian Act is not part of the Constitution. It is an act passed by Parliament, and just like any other act, it was just amended just recently again through Parliament, because it's just an act of Parliament, and they can amend it, they could even repeal it without changing anything in the Constitution. The problem becomes if you repeal it, then you have no regulations for the reserves and administering the Indian people, even though the Constitution still requires that.
And that refers
so that leads you back to the initial step, which is the Constitution itself.
And that refers to funds, schooling, all that kind of stuff, right? That all comes through the Indian Act?
Yes, the Indian Act is the tool. That's all the regulations of how that will be done. Mm-hmm. So it's the administration.
And the Indian Act was revised time and time again over the years to basically suit the chiefs, not necessarily, in fact, not at all, the Aboriginal grassroots people. And that's why the chiefs didn't want to abolish the Indian Act, even though in 1969 Pierre Elliott Trudeau presented the white paper and tried to abolish the Indian Act, and all of the chiefs screamed assimilation. That's their gig for not having to get along with other people, and or go along with anything that all the other Canadians are willing to go along with. So we know that we've tried to abolish the Indian Act. So when they turn around and call it a racist piece of paper, we know that Canada is not to blame for the continuation of it. Perhaps the institution of it, like having instituted that Indian Act, is Canada's, I think, fault. And we have to get out of that, but the chiefs have really perpetuated it.
Well, and again, one other thing that people should understand that's in the Indian Act that's quite important in all of this is the tax exemption on reserves. The tax exemptions that exist are through a section of the Indian Act.
Mm-hmm. And that's what they want to keep the Indian Act for.
It's proof. Giving all of those tax exemptions is proof of a certain benevolence intended. I mean, those were breaks.
Yes, not genocide, proof of benevolence. Yes, you're right.
I mean, those were breaks that were given to them to try and help them out economically on the reserves. And again, though, all of these things are necessary in order to maintain the institutional division between us as peoples, which is why I don't care whether they work well or not. They're wrong. They're just fundamentally wrong. They are Canadian citizens living on that reserve, and they should be taxed and schooled and medicined the same way all Canadian citizens are. And it's because we have, in our Constitution, we have them as a separate legal entity. Therefore, we have to create a separate education system, a separate medical provision system, a separate legal system on the reserves. For instance, the band councils that exist on the reserve, the elected ones, those are created by the Indian Act. So
right.
If you were to just remove the Indian Act, there would be no band councils on the reserve. There would really be no authority on a lot of the reserves, because they're not just treated like regular Canadian municipalities under the law.
Okay, Gerry, right now you don't know what I've done. I went over and I got my 2 pamphlets from Health Canada, Eating Well, Canada's Food Guide, Eating Well with Canada's Food Guide, and they are 2 different ones. And there's only 2, there are only 2. Even though there are many, many cultures and many, many races of people, all of them here in Canada, there are only 2 health guides. And one of them is for Aboriginal people, and one of them is for, well, everybody else in the whole entire world. So
yes.
Aboriginals are different than everyone else in the world, and Canada is accommodating this.
Well, and again, it flows from the original distinction in the Constitution. There's no distinction vis-a-vis Asians or Africans. If you were to argue that the food guide was different because, they have different food customs, etc., and a different diet, then you would certainly have to argue the same for immigrants coming to this country.
Absolutely. I mean, the truth, yes.
And right, and we don't do that.
Truth, in fact,
the reality is there has to ultimately be a separate everything provided by the government for Aboriginals, because they are a separate other in the Constitution.
And so let's stop here, Gerry, and let's just remind the Canadian public, innocent taxpayers, that not only are they distinct and separate in our Constitution, but at every single level, provincial, municipal, provincial, and federal. They are in every department. They're in every single government agency, body, department. Every single one.
Yes, and that's what makes it impossible to come up with a figure of an annual cost to
Yes.
administer segregation.
Anywhere from $12 billion to $22 billion a year for only 2 million people. 2 million people. Anywhere from $12 billion to $22 billion a year. That's astronomical.
Well, and again, though, you're creating a second bureaucracy for their education system and their health system when we already have those provincial
Yes,
for everybody
yes,
else.
yes,
So
yes.
you're paying a whole bunch of government people.
And it,
I mean, let me put it this way. The Canadian people can understand this really simply. This is another version of having to have a French version of everything in Canada. We all know how much it's cost Canada for the government to have to produce a French version of everything that the federal government does. And people have complained about it, and as a waste, and most of it has been a waste for a long, long time. Well, now on top of that, we're going to add, and we are adding, the Aboriginal population.
well, except it's not, you know, when you and I hear from the Aboriginal population across Canada, one of the first things we heard when we started end race-based law was the patronizing verbiage of, you know, we're not all one people, although they speak as if one brush. Whenever they're attacking Canada, they speak as if one brush, but as soon as you address them as one brush, there's suddenly 600, they scatter, and there's 600 plus nations, and they're totally different, except they all have the same agenda, which is to bash Canada, blame Canada, and extort from Canada, and Canada is basically innocent taxpayers. It's nothing but just innocent people. And so off to you. We are innocent people. We haven't done anything to these people.
Cry about this in the end.
Well, you know, Gerry, I told you that this is a current thing that happened to me last night, and I'm going to just jump right in and add it here because this man is not about last night. It represents the so-called white. I don't even know what white is. That's a different subject. You know, Italian, Swedish, what is white? They tell us not, the Aboriginals tell us not to lump them all together, but that's all they ever do with white people. And white people are not the same people. They come from Romania, they come from Sweden, they come from Russia, they come from Poland, they come from a lot of different places. And they don't have the same culture, the same languages, the same customs. So, you know, calling people white people itself is a slur.
Well, the only ones who even remotely qualify anyway are some English people and some Scandinavians. The rest of so-called white people around the world are mixed race.
Oh, they're all mixed race. We're all mixed races. The Europeans are all mixed races.
And beige would be a better description rather than white.
Well, how about just human being?
If you've ever seen a pale white English girl or Scandinavian blonde who truly is white-skinned, you realize that most people are beige.
Yes, exactly. Well, so this John Turner he's an actor, this, you know, really pompous attitude, called me every name under the book, said that the atrocities that we did to the natives, you know. So anyway, this is where Gerry and I come in. First of all, if we call school an atrocity, then we have to find another word for real atrocity. Secondly, we all went to the same school system. We all have been subjected to far worse histories than the Aboriginals. We all lost our languages. We all lost our cultures. We lost our families. My Baba came from the Ukraine, lost her family, never saw them again. Lost way more than the Aboriginals ever did. Lost their land. Lost everything that they identified with, lost way more than the Aboriginals ever did, and still came here and built a great nation. So, like, there's no explaining this problem that the Aboriginals have except that the chiefs have kept them stuck in this segregated, non-assimilated, like they could have hung on to their culture and still been our friends.
Well, and where Canadians come into this is it is Canada that created its own constitution and institutionalized all this stuff. It is Canada that wrote all these laws pertaining to, quote, Indians, unquote. And Canadians can quite simply undo these mistakes.
Yes, we can, Aboriginals.
That's that's like the unthinkable on this issue. Like you almost will never hear someone suggest that.
Yeah.
As if we're forced to live with this divide.
For eternity. So our grandchildren, our great-great-great-grandchildren are going to be paying off natives, and that consistently keeps the divide between everyone.
Canadians should understand that the Aboriginal leaders and activists emphasize that this is supposed to be forever. The treaties are supposed to be forever. So in other words, the obligations and the division is supposed to last forever. That being the case, you must understand there's nothing that Canada or the Canadian government can do that will fix it with that kind of an attitude, except to actually just end it once and for all.
Yes, we are the majority.
There really is. Well, even aside from that, I mean, in terms of just a genuine desire to overcome this divide.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what I mean. When I say we are the majority, I mean all Canadians. I've never self-identified with being white ever in my life. Not until I was 51 years old and got involved in race-based law when Idle No More first started up in late 2010, 12. Did I ever know even that I was white, and did I ever even notice that Aboriginals were Aboriginals? I grew up...
Most Canadians do recognize the danger of having segregated communities.
Absolutely. I mean, all Canadians have grown up with each other. The thing that separates really does, that we're not different. Our commonalities between all of us are much more than our differences. But they've been segregated, whereas we've all been integrated.
Well, but it was the British and then the Canadian government that created all those reserves. They're still creating new ones. So it is still the Canadian government at this point that is enabling segregation. It's not taking a tough stand against segregation.
Well, you know, it's because the Aboriginal chiefs really and truly push for that segregation.
I understand, and I understand why Aboriginal chiefs would push for what they desired in their self-interest. What I don't understand is why Canadian leaders don't push for what Canadians desire. If it's such a good thing that Aboriginal leaders get what they want, why is it not a good thing that the Canadian people get the kind of society that they want, which is not a segregated society? We don't want a segregated. Why can't we have what we want? And why don't our leaders push our value system instead of just caving in to what's basically a race-based value system?
Well, they were this
tribal past.
The tribes in Canada, 600 plus, fought each other, were not integrated, did not at any given time in their history come together as a unit for any purpose other than to blame Canada for our existence here at the same time as theirs. Fact.
Again, though, what I was getting at is why Canadians are okay with this.
I agree.
Why Canadian political leaders are okay with this. Why the government is still enabling this by creating new tribes. Why the courts are still designating more and more categories of people under this separate designation, like they just did with the Métis.
Well, here's what's interesting. The Métis are a great example of how ignorant this whole process is. The Métis are a combination of people. They've now established that they are a separate people, individual, made up of a whole bunch of different people. And so it's really gotten ridiculous. They're a separate group of people. It was like, oh my God, we're all crossbred.
Yeah.
We've been here for millions of years. We're all crossbred.
But once you accept the different designations and the different categories, which Canada did in the very beginning, both with Quebec and with the Indian people, then you have screwed yourself. You can dream all you want about this multicultural society and everybody overcomes all their divisions and holds hands together and dances like 1968. But if you're pursuing policies that are creating the opposite in your country, then you're just dreaming a fantasy.
Gerry...
And what I don't get is why we would continue 150 years later to pursue the same policies that we don't agree with as a people. We don't want a segregated race
And when he says we, I think what the Aboriginals have really missed, and I've listened to them talk for a number of years now about white people. They don't get that Canada is not white people. It's people from all around the world, and they have all come here willing to accept our freedom of speech, our laws, our way of life.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Part of that, Michelle, is because of the persecution a lot of them faced at home, which is why they came to North America.
Which is what the Aboriginals never faced. The Aboriginals have never actually truly faced genocide or true persecution.
And people come here with the hope that they have found a place where that stuff doesn't matter, where it's who you are as a person that matters, what you've accomplished with your life that matters.
Yeah.
And that's our fundamental value system that our leaders are not pushing, that we're caving in on all the time. That's the fundamental basis of our nation, and that includes all Canadians.
Yes, and I want to...
And the Indian people, despite their separate constitutional designation, they are Canadian citizens.
And Gerry, I want to just jump in and say that, I think what the Aboriginals really do miss is that all of these peoples have grown through the Canadian experience to be less racist, to be more integrated, to be more accepting, to be more allowing of other people to influence them. It's been a process, just a minute, it's been a process for everyone from around the world. So if you were Italian, you really, a long time ago, wanted your kid to marry an Italian girl. But, nowadays, like love happens between all races, and these things, they take time, but they eventually work themselves up because we do truly have much more in common than we do differences. And so I think the Aboriginals have forgotten that, or don't know that we're not all just one people, that there were obstacles and bigotries that everyone who's come to Canada has had to overcome. The Taiwanese family who had to accept that their daughter married an East Indian man. These things are happening on a constant basis in Canada. We are an evolving culture, and what we really want is for the Aboriginals to come with us and contribute to this evolving culture. We're not a stagnant people. They're not stagnant anymore either. Things have changed. They can't go back. We have to go forward together. We can't talk about the past anymore. It's gone. None of us have anything to do with it. We need to march forward together. I really care about their plight. I care about the problems that they're having, but this is just, these race laws and these race separations and agendas are just, they've gone too far. They're not right. They're not healthy. So I'm handing it over back to you. Sorry, Gerry. Thank you for letting me go.
No, that's okay. I was just thinking, we didn't discuss how long we were going to ramble with this first get-together either.
I know.
And where we were headed in the end.
And this is what Gerry and I do. I want you all to know that Gerry and I are going to do a lot of radio shows and podcasts because this is what we do behind the scenes all the time. Gerry and I talk about this issue on a constant basis, and we have for years and years and years. And I kept saying we have to record these conversations. I have spoken a little more than I really wanted to. I wanted Gerry to get going, but we're going to do more. And it's not that I'm ending this now. It's that I really want to hand this more and more over to Gerry because he's the spokesman between the two of us, and I'm really just the agitator. Aren't I, Gerry?
Well, I was just going to say, I think we've done an okay introduction here to what we're about.
Yeah.
And we need to check this technically, etc. too, being our first go at.
Okay, so I'm going to turn off the camera.
I wanted to say that we will be going over the petition that we have addressed to the Government of Canada. We'll be going over it section by section. I have mentioned today how that constitutional separation is at the root of the problem, and the petition addresses that. And so I'll be explaining exactly how. We'll have another get-together where we'll go through it clause by clause.
Yes, we're going to go through the petition clause by clause. That'll be a separate video and radio podcast. And we want to say at the end of this broadcast that Gerry and I both agree that, and on our Facebook page, we have been extremely diligent about keeping all abuse and all hatred and anything that cuts below the line off of our page. And we're really privileged when Aboriginals come onto our page and contribute in a positive way. And we really love for more of them to come and care and participate in the idea the possibility of a unified Canada. Cheers.